My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this will continue my coverage of The Two Towers with small details that Peter Jackson kind of changed a little bit that you probably wouldn't notice unless you were pretty familiar with the book. And some of the ones that I did in my last video on the details that he got right kind of fit in this category a little bit, but I put some of those in that other video because I thought they were more of a nod to the true original, whereas this is more, the ones in this video are going to be a little bit more along the lines of he just changed it for the sake of whatever and not really trying to be true to the story exactly. And you'll get a sense for why that is with our very first one, which is the time when Frodo and Sam are climbing down a rope trying to get down a cliff face, and Frodo ends up slipping and falling, and Sam, of course, is panicked, thinking he's about to fall to his death, and he actually doesn't fall that far, hits the bottom, and says, "I think I found the bottom." Well, it doesn't exactly happen like that in the book, and you can see why Peter Jackson changed it, because it makes for a little bit more comedy in the movie, which, you know, understandably, he's trying to add a little bit of levity to a not very, amusing situation. And the way it goes down in the book is at least similar, because what happens is Frodo is trying to find a way down without rope because Sam has forgotten that he has it. And then he slips and slides down to a ledge that is not actually the bottom of the cliff, but high enough that he doesn't, get hurt. And it's after this point that Sam actually remembers the rope. So you see what I mean? Like, Frodo and Sam falling, or one of them falling, is accurate to the book, but the reason that Peter Jackson puts this little detail in the way that he does is not because he's trying to be true to the story. It's more that he is deliberately altering it so as to create a specific effect for his own purposes. This next one is not exactly the same kind of thing, but it's the kind of thing that I put in this list because it's one where I don't understand why he didn't use the original, because it seems so natural to use the original, and yet he didn't. Because what happens next with Frodo and Sam is that they're trying to figure out, well, how are we going to get this rope down? It's basically stuck there forever. And in both the book and the movie, they have a bit of a conversation about this. The conversation in the book is longer, which makes sense. You have all the time you want in a book. And Sam is talking about, in both, how it's not going to come free easily because it's one of his knots, and he knows something about tying knots. Well, nevertheless, in the book, when Sam says the name Galadriel, because he says Galadriel made the rope comes loose. And then they're both kind of astonished at this, and Frodo's like, "Wow, I think I trusted my weight to your knot." And Sam insists, "I think the rope came loose on its own when I said Galadriel." Well, in the movie, it's, they're talking about how it's a shame because Galadriel made that, and then Sam says, "Real elvish rope." Frodo then, or maybe it was actually Sam that tugs on it, and then it just comes loose, and then it falls down, and Sam, is looking at it like, "What?" And Frodo looks at him and says, "Real elvish rope." I actually don't like the way that Peter Jackson made this change, because yes, it's kind of the same thing, but in the movie, Frodo is not as skeptical as he is in the book, and it looks like he's kind of poking fun at Sam, and it's not even really clear whether he's poking fun on the grounds of, it's real elvish rope and it's not very good, or it's real elvish rope and it magically came loose, or, it's kind of ambiguous the way that Frodo does this. And so, it's kind of the same thing, but not really. And unless you really remember this conversation from the book, you won't necessarily remember the detailed nuance and how the different lead-up and follow-up to the event really changes the dynamic between the two characters. Because I think in the book, what we're really getting that we don't get in the movie is Sam is still kind of in that mode of elves are magical and everything they do is wondrous, whereas Frodo has a little bit different of a perspective. he doesn't really see everything that elves do as being wonderful, magical, and capable of doing things that don't make sense to his own, normal experience. Here's another one, again involving Frodo and Sam, and this time the detail really is kind of subtle because it happens fairly quickly. What happens is Gollum is ambushed by Frodo and Sam, and there ends up being a tussle, of course. In the movie, it's less of an ambush because they're just pretending to sleep and then surprise him, so it's not really an ambush, but in the book, it's definitely an ambush. And in the process, Sam gets injured in both versions. But the difference in the movie is, unlike in the book where Gollum bites him on the shoulder, in the movie, he actually bites him on the neck, which is, kind of a lot more dangerous. But, the interesting detail there is just, it's a few inches one way or the other. It's like, if you're not paying attention, you're not even necessarily going to notice that. Here's another change that I thought was actually a very important one that I wish had not been changed. But and this is one that's probably a little easier to catch even for casual book fans because Frodo makes such a big deal out of it. When Gollum swears by the precious, he swears by the precious in the book, but he swears on the precious in the movie. And the difference here is it's really significant because Frodo in the book, when Gollum tries to swear on the precious, he says, no, all you want to do is see it again, even though you know it'll drive you mad. When Frodo is saying this, we know from what he's saying that what he's anticipating is that Gollum literally wants to put his hand on the ring, like in modern times a lot of people put their hands on Bibles, like in a court of law or whatever. And that's what he means by swearing on it. Whereas in the movie, this distinction is not made at all. And this is a change which I think is not worth making for the little bit of time that it saves, because it shows in the book, not in the movie because we don't get it, in the book it shows how seriously Frodo takes the whole situation and how dangerous he recognizes that the ring is, and that Gollum can still be really tricky about things. And so he says, no, you could swear by it if you must. You're not going to swear on it. Whereas in the movie, this whole distinction is lost because Gollum says, I'll swear on the precious, and we never see the ring, actually, because he doesn't actually put his hand on it. And so swearing on it isn't actually swearing on it at all. So this is, again, it's kind of easier to spot this one, even for casual readers, because Frodo does make a huge deal out of it. But it just glides over it so quickly in the movie that you might not really think about it that much. This next one is also kind of a thing that you could probably catch fairly easily, even if you're not a really, really close reader. But this is when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are chasing the Uruk-hai, and we get this funny line from Gimli, which, again, it's comedy in the middle of a tense situation, where he says, we dwarves are natural sprinters, very dangerous at close distances. And he says he's wasted on cross-country. This is, of course, the opposite of what we get in the book, because in the book, what we learn constantly is that dwarves endure. They're really good at toil and labor and carrying burdens and doing things long haul. You don't necessarily get anything in the book about them being particularly good sprinters. And it's, it doesn't make any real sense to say that they're good at sprinting because they're short with stubby legs compared to, elves and men. So, this change is, again, something that you probably wouldn't have a hard time catching. But again, because of the way it's done in the movie to create the humor, it's probably something that you would let go. But it was always something that kind of bugged me because A, it doesn't even make sense just looking at him. And B, it also is just kind of like, why did you even need to throw that in there? I mean, yes, it's to create humor in a situation that kind of needs a little bit of levity, but at least from a cinematic standpoint, it needs a little bit of levity. But I never really cared for it. And again, it's like if you're just kind of going along with the flow of the movie and taking it as the humor that it is, you won't necessarily think about that disconnect. Another one, and this one involves Aragorn, not Gimli, that you might miss just because, again, this is the way the movie has to be. It kind of shortens everything. Is that Aragorn, when they first meet Éomer, gives Éomer his right name right off the bat. Whereas in the book, he says, I am called Strider. Notice he doesn't say my name is Strider. He's being very accurate. He says, I am called Strider. And he does this, in part to conceal his own identity to some extent, but he does end up giving his right name. But it leads to a really great sequence where when he tells Éomer, we have traveled, from wherever to here in X number of days, and Éomer's like, what? Strider's too wimpy a name. You should be called Wingfoot. We don't get any of that in the movie because he never gets called Strider in the first place, which I think would have been a great thing to throw in there. I think it would have been a really fun scene to actually have that happen. But the whole encounter with Éomer and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli is tonally very different in the movie than it is in the book, because both of them start with suspicion, but by the end of it, Aragorn has awed Éomer, and Éomer is very, let's say, almost a fan of Aragorn by that point, and is actually asking him to come with him to Edoras and to help with the king and all this stuff. But, we don't get that because, again, they're having to crop everything down to keep everything short enough for a 3.5-hour movie. So it doesn't quite get, there, and we miss that one little detail because we're just in the hurry to get that conversation through. So the fact that he uses his right name instead of Strider initially is just kind of lost. Going back to Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, we get a line in the marshes in the movie where Gollum says, soft and quick as shadows we must be, which seems a little odd in a place where there are literally no observers. Well, it's odd because in the book, this line is actually said somewhere where there might be observers, which is actually closer to the Black Gate, which they have just decided they're not going to try to enter, and in fact they're going to go south and try Cirith Ungol. So, again, if you've read Tolkien, that this line exists, probably, because it's such a Tolkienian phrase in a lot of ways. And you might be recognizing it, but you won't necessarily remember offhand where this line is said, even if you remember it's Gollum who says it. So it's easy to miss that this is a slight change, and it makes a lot more sense where it's actually said in the book. This one, you could almost put in the other category of details that Peter Jackson got right, and I put it in this one kind of, it's hard to pick which one it should really go in, but, I made my decision. When Gollum eats the worm in the Dead Marshes, this is actually a reference to the part in the book where I think it's Sam who speculates, but does not see that Gollum has been eating worms, because both of the hobbits are like, what is he eating? Because he won't eat their limbas. He won't eat, really anything they have on them, and they never really see him eat. And so they're kind of speculating, and one of them speculates, is he finding worms or something to eat? Because what else could he be eating out here? So it's kind of in the category of, it's kind of a nod to the book of, this is coming from the source material, but it's also not necessarily, because we don't know that Gollum is eating worms. And so it's also easy to miss the fact that in the book, we almost take it for granted that whatever the hobbits are speculating probably has to be right. And so it seems like that, must be the case. Therefore, we might have forgotten since the time of our last read when we watched the movie that we never actually see him do it. And so when we see him do it in the movie, that's not actually accurate necessarily. Going back to the three hunters with Gandalf this time, and this is right after they've met Gandalf in the movie. But what happens is Gandalf calls Shadowfax, and Legolas, who is looking out and sees the horse coming, says, that is one of the Mearas, unless my eyes are cheated by some spell. This is another line that's straight out of the book, but again, it's in the wrong person's mouth, and it's at the wrong time to boot. Because it's actually some unnamed guard at the gate of Edoras who says this, which makes sense because the Maeras are the line of horses that are descended from the horse of Eorl the Young way, 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 way back, some 500 years. Legolas would not necessarily know this, but of course in the movie, Legolas is the guy who knows everything and is super wise and everything else because he's an elf, and that's just apparently the way elves are, right? And it's funny because Legolas's whole character is so different when you think about it, because Legolas, in some ways, between Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, is the most childish in the sense that he's the most likely to engage in humor in the book, and he also knows the least in a lot of ways, because he even tells Aragorn, "You've traveled more than me, I don't know anything about Ents." So, Aragorn thought that Legolas might, being a wood elf, but Legolas is like, "I haven't been anywhere, I don't know anything." So the difference is, in the movie, Legolas is just this know-it-all who knows everything, and you wouldn't have to be a careful reader to catch that difference, but it is not easy to remember necessarily that some random unnamed guard at Edoras just is the one who said that instead of Legolas. Again, it's one of those things, I know that's a line from the book, but I don't remember who said it or where. So, a change that you wouldn't necessarily notice unless you were really, really solid on your trivia. This next one is a bit of an odd one, and it comes down to some interesting things that Peter Jackson did with the elven cloaks. Sam, at some point in both the book and the movie, says, "I bet our elvish cloaks won't even hide us in there." And I think in both the book and movie, it's at the Black Gate where this gets said, because they're contemplating, for the first time, actually entering Mordor. And the difference is, in the movie, the way that the elven cloaks actually function is seemingly very different from the way that they function in the book. In fact, when this is said in the movie, we have literally just had a direct instance of the cloak hiding them, Frodo and Sam that is, from the Easterlings, who are literally standing right there, because apparently the cloak has magical clingy properties with rock dust. Yeah, so, I mean, it's really not exactly clear why Sam thinks that the cloak that literally just hid them at a distance of 5 feet, maybe, won't hide them in Mordor. But in the book, that actually makes a little more sense, because when they get the cloaks in the first place, one of the things that they're told by the elves is that they put the love of everything that, their love of things like trees and rivers and all this other stuff into everything they make. And that's, kind of why the cloaks do what they do. They kind of shimmer and change hue depending on how you look at them. But of course, none of that exists in Mordor. And so, yeah, you could see why it wouldn't work in Mordor. Whereas apparently in the movie, it's just it does exactly what it needs to do to provide camouflage. I don't know. So, again, in this case, it's one of those where it's the same person says it, and in the same place and time, pretty much, but the meaning is actually totally different. Now, this next one is one that, if you have read the book really at all, you probably would catch this, obviously, and I could have, again, kind of put this into the other category of details Peter Jackson got right, except it's so out of place, it doesn't really work that way. And the reason I put it here is because even though it's fairly easy to catch, it's also one of those where if you read the book one time years ago and are one of those people that just didn't care for that whole section from the Old Forest through the Barrow Downs, you may not remember any much of the details, right? And this is the whole Old Man Willow thing. And this is really only in the extended version, if I remember correctly. But when Merry and Pippin are kind of chasing each other around over the water from the stream, presumably, that's making them taller, they end up getting entangled in the roots of a living tree that's kind of swallowing them up. And then Treebeard comes along and says, "You should not be waking." And then he goes into a bunch of lines that Tom Bombadil uses against Old Man Willow in the book. So, again, you might remember, if your memory of the books are fuzzy, but you might remember the lines and go, I remember that. But if you were one of those people who was not really a fan of all the Tom Bombadil chapters, you might not remember exactly where that came from or why. But it's one of the easier ones to spot. But I had to put it in here because I had no other place really to put this particular event, which I think had to be mentioned because, again, it is out of Tolkien, but so out of place. This next one is a bit of an odd one, and this is one where it's not so much that it's hard to spot if you know your stuff, but I think it's more of an issue where we tend to kind of, or at least some people tend to read kind of their own values into the Lord of the Rings and don't really pay attention to how the characters really actually operate. Because when Aragorn stops Theoden from killing Wormtongue in the movie, he says enough blood has been spilled on his account. This does not happen in the book at all. What actually goes down in the book is that Gandalf basically tells Theoden, here's what I would do. I would, to slay Wormtongue would be just because of all the things that he's done, but you could give him like another chance and see if he'll actually follow you. And so Theoden ends up offering him the opportunity, hey, if you really are loyal, you can come with me and go to the war, or you can take a horse and go wherever you want. This is a very Solomonic moment in the book, I think. Theoden is displaying a lot of Solomon-esque wisdom because he's basically giving Wormtongue the choice of either proving he's a traitor or risking his life, which, as a true traitor, of course, he picks, going traitor. But the thing that drives me nuts about this is that it's the kind of thing where Aragorn's action in the movie is the kind of thing that a lot of people with a more modern sense of morality, and I mean modern in the sense of like the last 100 years maybe, would probably see that and go, oh yeah, that's totally, the right thing to do. Because we see this in movies and stories everywhere. It's like, I couldn't even begin to list all the movies and shows where something exactly like this happened, where it's like, enough people have been killed, we don't need to kill one more person. It's like, in a medieval era, people would have looked at you like, are you nuts? This guy's killed a bunch of people and now you're going to let him go because one more death is a bad thing? But, that being said, the way Theoden handles it in the book is a way of getting the actual proof that he needs to correctly judge him. And then the judgment, theoretically comes later after they've beaten Saruman, which it never does, at least not from Theoden's hand. It comes in a totally different fashion at the end of the book. But it's one of those things where, because of our modern sensibilities, we might look at Aragorn's actions here and go, yeah, that makes total sense. Whereas in the book, if you just read the book, I don't think you would actually get that kind of a thing from either Aragorn or Gandalf. I mean, Gandalf straight up says, to slay it would be just. He's out and out saying, yeah, he deserves death, and to slay it would, to slay it, he says it, because Wormtongue is that debased, would be just. It would be just to kill Wormtongue. But he leaves it to Theoden, who then, kind of takes, this approach of, well, I'm going to let you pick, and you'll prove to me what your true intentions are. So it's a very different style and a very different kind of thing, which I think, again, most modern audiences are not going to pick up on the real difference between Aragorn's mercy and Theoden's, because they're very different, and it's a very different rationale behind them. Shortly after this, when they're trying to get ready to leave for Helm's Deep, we get a scene where there's a horse going crazy. Éowyn ends up telling Aragorn that it was her brother's, or her cousin's horse, rather, and Aragorn learns its name is Brago, and then he says in Elvish, your name is Kingly. So it's really interesting because Brago is actually the name of a king in the line of the kings of Rohan. And this is one, so the reason I put this in this list is obvious. You wouldn't know that unless you read the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. Like, you would not catch that unless you really were a super fan and read all the appendices, which a lot of people don't do, and you remembered the names of these kings of Rohan that have no bearing on the story at all. So, yeah. And this is one of those where you could arguably even put this one in the other list of details that he got right, but it's not really, because, I mean, like, yeah, it's a nod to the fact that there is a king of Rohan, but it's not the same thing as getting the detail correct, because the horse is not a king of Rohan. This next one is very complicated in some ways, and a lot of us probably miss this because of the really amazing quality of Andy Serkis's performance as Gollum and Smeagol. He does a great, fantastic job with the whole split personality dynamic. But in the book, we don't get the same kind of dynamic that we get in the movie. In the movie, we get a very clear distinction between Gollum, kind of okay and innocent, at least in the Two Towers we do. In the Return of the King, it gets a little more fuzzy because, you know, it's like, who's really what in this situation? But in the Two Towers, at least, we get this idea that Gollum is innocent and okay. I mean, Smeagol is innocent and okay, and Gollum is the bad one who wants to do all the bad stuff. And then Smeagol tells Gollum to go, and he goes, and then he's nice for a while, and then something mean happens, and Gollum comes back. In the book, we never really get that, and it's a little harder to be really sure what's going on, because, of course, in the book, we only get the, you know, what little we get from this whole dynamic from the eyes of Frodo and Sam. Primarily Sam, who's not around him all the time to get all the data. Whereas in the movie, we're privy to Gollum and Smeagol's private thoughts, right? But in the book, the whole dynamic is, as Sam puts it, really between two baddies, and they just have kind of different methods and motives. But he calls them Slinker and Stinker, and Slinker is Smeagol and Stinker is Gollum, at least by my reading. But the whole idea is, in the book, there is no good side to Gollum anymore. There's really not. I mean, he's a bad guy no matter how you slice it. And Frodo is aware of this fact, and he's not fooled by Gollum's attempts to act nice and do whatever. He knows that Gollum is still after the ring, and he's, you know. So, again, the reason I put this one in this list is because Andy Serkis's performance is so good that a lot of us are tempted to just, you know, fall into that and be like, oh yeah, man, that is a great Gollum. And it is a great movie Gollum. Not going to deny that. It is fantastic. His performance is top-notch, A+, 100 out of 100. I mean, it's just great. But it's not really the Gollum-Smeagol dynamic that we get in the book. It is a little different. And by a little different, I mean a lot different, but it's subtle. Here's another one that, unless you're really familiar with your, you know, who says what when, you would miss, because you'll recognize the line, even if you're a fairly casual reader probably, but not really remember who said it. And this is Faramir's line in the movie, but Sam's thoughts in the book about wondering who the bad guy that is lying at his feet dead is. You know, where did he come from? Did he, you know, was he really evil at heart? And, you know, what threats or lies led him far away from his home? All this stuff, and of course I'm not quoting it properly, and it sounds a lot better in the actual words of the book. But in the movie, it's Faramir who says it out loud, and it's Sam who thinks it to himself in the book. And the distinction there is not very big, because they both have kind of the same idea. Although Faramir's thoughts seem to be from a more cynical type of approach, like, you know, everything about this is just ugly, and, you know, we don't need to be... It's not really clear exactly to me where Peter Jackson was trying to go with this in the movie, but the way that David Wenham delivers the line just never really sat the same to me as what I got out of reading it in the book as Sam's thoughts. Because Sam's thoughts, I think, are more of an awakening. Like, these are just people. Like, why are they involved in this? Are they really evil? Or is this just some family guy who got conscripted, Whereas Faramir's lines are definitely the line of a tried warrior who is jaded by his experience. So there's a difference there, I think, in the way that they're feeling that emotion, but it's definitely also a difference of who said it and also slightly when. The next one is another one that is only in the extended cut, I believe. Well, actually, it may be in the original. But when they're on their way to Helm's Deep, Theoden and Aragorn are talking about Éowyn, and Theoden says in the movie that Éowyn's father was killed when she was just a girl, and that, gives a specific story about it. And the specific story is not quite the same as the one you get in the book, which, again, you would probably not know if you did not read very carefully. Because, again, this story only comes in the appendices. We get a story where Éomer ends up dying because he's chasing an orc raiding party and then gets ambushed in the Immin Muil and killed as a result. But the story is slightly different in the movie. And, again, like, if you didn't read the appendices, and not that many people do, you would never know how Éomer actually died in the book. Speaking of the appendices, we get another one with Elrond's opposition to Aragorn and Arwen's marriage. Now, in the book, if you never read the appendices, you wouldn't really know anything about this, except for the fact that Elrond and Arwen, when they part, have a bitter parting, which you obviously know they're going to be broken up about it because Elrond is going to live forever as an elf in Valinor or Tol Eressëa, whereas Arwen has decided she's going to remain in Middle-earth and live as a mortal, which means she may not even see him ever again in the afterlife, such as there is one in Tolkien's Legendarium. So you know that they're unhappy about the whole, division of their fates, but you don't really know any of the details. And so in the movie, you might be aware that Elrond's really not happy about this whole marriage situation, but you wouldn't know why and to what extent he really pushes that. Well, in the book, if you read the appendices, you know that he's not super happy about it, but he does basically tell Aragorn when he learns of Aragorn's interest in marrying his daughter, it's like, I'm not really thrilled about this, but she's definitely not marrying anybody less than the king of Arnor and Gondor, so get to work, buddy. So, the difference being in the movie, you get the idea that Elrond is just not open to the idea at all. In the book, he is, although he's not happy about it. And the rationale there is less to do with, no, I'm not letting my daughter marry a mortal. It's, I'm not going to let her marry just any mortal, because there needs to be like a really good reason for her to stick around in Middle-earth. And you can see if, and this goes even deeper, because if you understand kind of the history of elf-man unions in Tolkien's Legendarium, and especially if you've read, I think it's in Morgoth's Ring, that this kind of comes up with regard to one of the sons of Feanor and Andreth, the woman who has a debate with Finrod in the Athrabeth. And I don't remember if it's in the Athrabeth that it talks about this or if it's somewhere else, but she was in love with one of Feanor's, no, not Feanor's sons, I'm sorry, one of Finarfin's sons, who is Finrod's brother, and it's either Ignor or Angrod, and I forget which one off the top of my head, but in the topic of, that being discussed, it gets mentioned that, it's probably not going to be the case that there's going to be many unions of elves and men, except for some high purpose that's, kind of part of the plan, the grand plan of Eru and the Valar. Well, you could see, with that as a background, that Elrond is thinking in terms of, I'm not going to leave Arwen here to just marry some guy who's going to be a ranger his whole life and get killed. It needs to be to reestablish the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, which will carry forward a lot of the history that has been, kind of transmitted from people in the past, Numenorians and elves and all this stuff. So you can get an idea of why in the book, if you've read this other stuff, that he's thinking in these terms. Whereas in the movie, of course, we don't have time to go into all that. So we just have to come up with he doesn't want his daughter being separated from him forever, and that's it. It's not quite that simple in the book. Here's one more, which is maybe a bit of a stretch, because again, partially because you might actually remember this if you read the book at all. But in the book, whenever Éomer first gives horses to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, Gimli's like, I don't need a horse, don't worry about it, I'm not going to ride anything that big. And Legolas says, you'll ride with me and you'll be fine. Well, in the movie, we actually see Gimli riding horses by himself, and it kind of gives us a comical moment, because at one point the horse spurs off and gallops, and he ends up falling from it, which is maybe an allusion to the fact that he shouldn't be riding a horse by himself in the first place. But, I just find this one a little bit funny, because we never even get a mention in the movie about how he doesn't want to ride a horse by himself. And even though it's kind of an easy thing to spot, you might not really remember that, because it only comes up the one time, and he's riding horses with Legolas after that a lot. This one is a maybe, maybe not one. And this is the last one for the Two Towers. And when I say maybe, maybe not, I mean, I'm not exactly sure how Peter Jackson intended this one, or whoever wrote the scene intended it. But in the movie, when Saruman is giving his little pep talk to all his Uruk-hai who are about to go off and try to kill the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep, he says, a new power is rising. And again, this is another one of those that I could include purely on the fact that this is a line that Saruman says, but in a completely different context. In the book, he says it to Gandalf when Gandalf comes to Isengard the first time, and he captures Gandalf and keeps him there. So there's that, but what I'm getting at here is actually, who is the new power? In the book, it's very clear that he's talking about Sauron. It's abundantly clear that that's who he's talking about. But in the movie, there are things in the movie that might lead you to think he's referring to Sauron. But in this context of this specific scene, it almost seems more like he's referring to himself and the orcs that he's commanding, which is really not right, but also an understandable thing for him to say, because he's, he is kind of setting up shop for himself in the book, or thinking he is, or it is, his exact loyalty and how much of it is him just self-aggrandizing is not 100% clear. So when that change happens, really. But in the movie, you get the idea that he's pretty much just straight up Sauron's servant. But then in this scene, when he says a new power is rising, it seems like he's talking about himself. Maybe he is talking about Sauron, and that was really supposed to be the idea. But it's kind of unclear. So if it's supposed to be himself that he's talking about, he's definitely not talking about the same power as he is in the book. But again, either way, you could kind of include this one on the grounds of he says this line in completely the wrong place. So, those are my details from the Two Towers that, unless you were a pretty good fan of the book in the first place, you wouldn't notice that these details were changed or altered in some way by Peter Jackson and his team. Let me know if you think I should have included any others, and of course I'll be continuing with more movie review type stuff with Return of the King in the near future, so be on the lookout for that. If you want to make sure you catch that, make sure you subscribe and click the bell icon if you're on YouTube. If you like this particular video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, share it around. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions, and check out the other social and support links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan DeFore, Robert Kendling, and Stephen Clayton.